Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us for this Microsoft Tech Talk. This is the first in the Microsoft Tech Talk workshop webinar series. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be starting momentarily as we're just waiting for the last couple of people to join us. In the meantime, just to cover off on some housekeeping, please note this webinar is recorded. It's a live webinar and you'll receive a copy of the recording after this. There'll be a chance for Q&A as well. Please, you can enter any of your questions in the Q&A panel that you should see up on your screen, and we'll have a chance to address them at the end. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Matt Smith, Microsoft Solutions Architect, who's your presenter today, and he'll be talking you through the ins and outs of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. This is very much a practical hands-on demonstration, and it's looking at practical applications, technical insights, as well as the latest trends. And Matt Smith has a long history of work in the Microsoft managed service space. He's been working in the industry for over 20 years and has been running for over 10 years, managing a number of high-profile clients across the UK in terms of the service delivery and development and architecture of Microsoft solutions. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Matt, who can take us through the body of the presentation. Thanks, to you.
Patrick, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This is going to be the first in a series of these Tech Talk sessions, so put feedback into the Q&A as well as any questions as we go along. Hopefully the next one will be in January, and we'll try and follow these logically. So I think we're going to look at conditional access in Azure Active Directory and that whole zero trust model in the next session. Today we're going to cover off the basics of Endpoint Manager. We'll do a little dive into the key areas of it and hopefully give you some tips along the way that you can use, especially if you've never worked with Endpoint Manager before or have just kind of touched the basics of it around mobile devices. There's an awful lot to cover, so we're going to move pretty quickly through a lot of the functions. So like I said, as we go along, put questions in the Q&A. I will come back to them at the end. I'll do my best to answer all of them. But if you have a specific scenario that you want to cover, get in touch with us. One of our account managers can schedule an hour of a kind of free consult as an initial piece with myself or another member of the pre-sales team. So let's get started. I'm going to run this as a live demo, as Patrick said. So I'm going to share in a browser window. So hopefully you'll get that. There we go. And we're going to drop straight here into Endpoint Manager and just start going through what the functions are. So I think the first thing to say is Endpoint Manager is kind of the convergence of Intune and Configuration Manager if you're using System Center on site, and to bring it all under one brand. And it really shows us the direction that Microsoft are taking this kind of cloud and hybrid management of devices. If I had to summarize the fundamental purpose of the service, then I'd say it's there to get apps and config out onto your devices and then validate that those controls are in place and operational going forward. So like I said, there's a lot to cover today. I'm going to try and do this kind of logically in order and pop your questions in as we go along. So to start with, I'm going to drop here into the devices window and just take you through a little bit around enrollment. So we have the four main operating system types that we support through Endpoint Manager: Windows, the iOS and iPads and iPhones operating system, Mac OS for your Mac PC clients, and Android to cover all those Google handsets. Now, for Windows itself, the basics of enrollment is taken care of if you set up Office 365. It's essentially just a DNS registration, and you can validate that in here with this CNAME validation to make sure that you're ready for Windows PC devices to enroll. Now, there's a number of ways that you get devices into Intune, there's direct enrollment through the PC itself, or there's the hybrid approach of bringing them in through Azure Active Directory. Either way, what's a key area that you want to be looking at is the autopilot deployment program. The idea behind that is to use these deployment processes here to control the out-of-box experience for the user. So when we're creating some settings for the users here, we're deciding whether or not it's going to be completely scripted for them, whether or not they're going to join Azure AD, or we're sticking with our hybrid model and they're staying on the Active Directory. And then we essentially opt to make those decisions for them as the PC boots up. And the idea here is to be able to ship equipment directly to the users without ever having to touch it in the IT department first. So autopilot profiles, really key to being able to simplify the process of onboarding Windows devices. An area that you should make sure you never forget when you're doing this through Endpoint Manager is Windows Hello for Business. For those of you that have been through this, you've probably tripped this up before. It's on by default in Windows, and if it's left as unconfigured here in Endpoint Manager, when the user's machines go through the enrollment process, whichever method it is, and join Endpoint Manager, they will be prompted to create device pins and put those settings into the machine. So whether you choose to use it or not, just make sure you have configured it in here so that it's either on or off. If you don't want them to be prompted, don't enable it. I would wholeheartedly suggest that you do want to introduce users to the Hello service and enable biometric logons and PIN numbers for the devices. So, as I say, I'm going to move fairly swiftly through some of these because we've got a lot to cover on here. I'm going to skip into the Apple services, and these are held or kind of combined together when we look at iOS or Mac OS in terms of enrollment. When we enroll Apple devices, the enrollment process is taken care of by a push certificate. So that's a fairly simple piece to sign up for. You get them from Apple. None of this costs anything extra. What I want to make sure that you're all aware of today is look into the Apple Business Manager service. If you're not using it at the moment, you should be. If you're dealing with iOS devices, whether they're devices that you own or they're devices that you're issuing apps to that your users own. So if you're doing a bring your own device type of model, Apple Business Manager is the key to really kind of maintaining complete control over the devices. It's done through establishing a link with an enrollment program token on here. The process is pretty straightforward. You go to business.apple.com and sign up. There is an evaluation process. So somebody in the business will need to validate that the company is who it says it is, and Apple will want to contact them to do that. Once that's in place, adding the connection into there is a case of downloading a couple of certificates and creating this profile. Within the enrollment token, we then have profiles that are specific to the type of device that they're bringing in. So if we're purchasing Mac laptops, MacBooks or iMacs or Mac Pros, or we're purchasing iPhones or iPads, if they're done and already attached to the Apple Business Manager account, then Apple Business Manager will automatically pass them to Endpoint Manager. So again, like the Windows process, you can ship Mac and or Apple equipment directly to your end users, or in the case of phones and tablets, you might have them shipped directly from your carrier if you're buying them through Vodafone or EE or one of those. So when we create the profiles in here, it's very similar to what we'd be doing for Windows, in that we are choosing how to enroll the device. So with the user affinity option is largely the standard because it's a device issued to the user. But if you're in a large shared device environment, without affinity might be useful. And there's a whole area that you need to look into there around shared device usage in the Apple ecosystem. But again, once we've specified some of these options on here, we're effectively saying whether or not the device can be removed from the system, and then we're using this service to decide whether or not to require the user to complete all of those startup settings for the Apple device, or we're going to make that decision for them and hide that piece. Quite a bit of testing that you need to do around that before you get to that stage. The key bit here is that you want to enable running the company portal in a single app mode once the enrollment completes. What that will do on the device is take them through the usual Apple startup sequence, again guided by what you've set here in the setup assistant. But when they get to the end of that, before they can get to the home screen of the device, the company portal app that would be downloaded for a bring your own device model is automatically put onto the machine, onto the device, and then the log on to that app is displayed, forcing the enrollment process to complete and assign the device to the user before they can use it. And that's how you kind of complete that loop there for the iOS devices. For macOS devices, it's largely the same. It's just another profile that you'll place in here with very similar questions. Again, this is all based on the idea that you're purchasing devices and having them allocated to your Apple Business Manager account in the first instance. So really key and important to use that Apple Business Manager service and get that in place right from the beginning. Now, the final enrollment area is around Google and the Android ecosystem. This is actually the simplest one in terms of setup. So there's nothing like the Apple Business Manager service that you need to go and enroll with and configure. You simply create a managed Google Play account, and there's some instructions given to you in here. Join that up, and that gives you access to be able to issue apps and settings to the user's devices. What's slightly more complicated in the Android ecosystem is there are actually three models for managing a device. We have personally owned devices, so this is the kind of bring your own device type of model, where the organization doesn't want to take any control or responsibility over the handset or the tablet itself. In that scenario, they'll be working with or using a work profile, and that's effectively a container within the Android device where you place your apps and your data, and then if you so choose, you can erase that container and the contents of it, and you can control the movement of data and access to services within that container when they're trying to use your Azure AD credentials. The second model is the fully managed corporate owned device. So that's a device that at the very first boot of the handset or the tablet, they enter the code or they scan the QR code if you're doing it that way. The system gives you those options in here. It will tell you the token that they can enter. And that will then take the device and hand the complete control of it to Endpoint Manager, so that they are not able to put their own apps on, or it has to follow the controls and the requirements that you want. Now, I said there's three. There's now a third way which is emerging, and some people are starting to use it, and that's where you have the fully owned and managed device, but you don't place all the restrictions and controls on it with Endpoint Manager. You allow the users to sign their own Google accounts in and add their own apps and use the device for their own purposes, but you also maintain separation from that personal usage by employing the work profile. And in doing either of these work profile settings, when you configure them, it's just a case of deciding the name that's going to be given to that profile so that there is one for the devices to adopt. So it's usually follows the kind of company name or something to that effect. So very little to actually do to enroll an Android device, but there are three choices. So the next bit that we're going to look at is enrollment restrictions and how we ensure that employees are only using the one that we want. Just before I finish on Android for the enrollment process, for that fully owned corporate device, I did say you have to put in that code or use the QR scan at the boot of the device. There is a model from Android, from Google, called Zero Touch that you can employ. The way to gain access to the Zero Touch account is to order some devices through a vendor that supports Zero Touch, and they will then issue you a log on to the Zero Touch service, and through the Zero Touch system you can then associate that with your Endpoint Manager account, and that's how devices can be automatically pushed, or Android devices can be automatically pushed into Endpoint Manager. So I said before, we want to then look at how we ensure users are coming to us with the right process for enrollment. That's done here through enrollment restrictions. There's always one default restriction policy that's in place, and out of the box it allows them to choose any option and any model that they want. So little tip for you, the first thing you want to do when you start investigating the use of Endpoint Manager is come into here, look at the settings available to you and decide if you do not want them enrolling personally owned devices, then you want to look at this section here and decide which models or which type of operating system they should not be connecting by themselves to your management service, and decide to block that personally owned function there. I would advocate at this stage completely blocking the Android device administrator process. I know there will be some models and some versions of the Android operating system that can't support the enterprise process, but they're going to be fairly old now, and Google are deprecating that device administrator function, so it will eventually be phased out. So if you've not started it, I would wholeheartedly advocate don't enable it from the beginning, and leave that one off. So device enrollment, a key area that you want to make sure that you're only getting the correct devices come into the service. So once we've got devices in the system, then usually our next step is to look at what we want to configure around them. Now the menu options here give you a handy way to drill down by platform and then look at the configuration profiles. You can also look at all of them all in one place from the policy section. So it's just two different views of the same thing. I'm going to bring up the whole list here and just give you a bit of an idea of what's possible and how you use it. So by no means am I going to try and go through every setting and every function. There's way too many to cover, but it follows the same logic of we have configuration profiles for each of the four operating system vendors. So let's start with Windows. It's the biggest area, has the most controls, although that's kind of arguably growing a lot in the Mac OS environment as well. So for Windows, we do still see profiles for Windows 8 and above. That's only because those functions still exist in Windows 10, but you can find pretty much anything that you'd want to under the Windows 10 and later profile setting. So I will show you an example of one or two of them in a minute, but this just gives you an idea of what's possible. So we have three types of profile that we create for Windows 10. We have templated profiles, so that's pretty much everything that you see below delivery optimization there, where they have settings that you can switch on and off, yes, no options, and drop down boxes that you can fill in basically on the profiles that will issue common settings out to Windows, joining Wi-Fi networks, issuing certificates, and placing certain restrictions on the device around their log-on capabilities, whether they can go to app stores, you know, how they can use printing, if you've got any display restrictions around them. So there's a whole host of these functions that are pre-created in these templates, so that you can go through and specify those. The other two types of profile that we have are either custom profiles. I will touch on this very briefly for you. Custom profiles allow you to pick up these URIs. It's like an open standard that allows you to address functions that are available in Windows. There's a catalog of these that you can look at. So if Microsoft have not yet created that as a template, or they don't exist in administrative templates, which I'll show you in a second, you can pretty much issue any control that you want to Windows through these custom policies. So look for the catalog on those to be able to see how they work. And administrative templates, which is rapidly becoming critical to kind of way we deploy these. These are the templates that most closely mimic what we're used to through group policy and Active Directory. This window will look sort of familiar to you. So it's broken down into computer settings and user settings. And these folders or these containers of settings closely represent what we had previously in group policy objects. So this is growing all the time. You can search for settings through here. You can look at all settings in the policy and just check to see if they have been configured or not. So if we need to see what settings are in a particular policy, we can bring those up here, or we can browse through the folders and pick out the various settings that we want. And then, just as we used to with group policy, enable, disable, and place the various values into them. So that's how we apply configuration to Windows. It's pretty comprehensive, and it gives us kind of all the controls that we would need over those devices. Issued over the web through the mobile device management engine of Windows, so no need to call home to a domain controller, no access over VPN or anything like that required to do it. Mac OS, iOS, and Android, all very similar in the way that you apply those profiles, but again, specific to the way the device is being managed and the type of device. So we have restrictions that we can place on the work profile function and restrictions we can place on the device function for Android. For iOS, that's handled slightly differently in that if a device has enrolled, then we are going to treat it as managed by us. However, you will note as we look at device controls for iOS, Microsoft have quite handily specified whether or not some of these functions require a complete enrollment. So the automated enrollment through the Apple Business Manager that signifies it's a completely owned device managed by you, or is supported by all enrollment types. So therefore, this setting will work for bring your own device and corporate owned devices. For those of you who are familiar with the Apple ecosystem, what we're leveraging here is something called the supervised function. And the only way to do that is if the device is attached to an Apple supervised account and then handed to the MDM provider. That's no different between any MDM solution. It's the way the Apple structure has been put together for security. So you just have to check as you create settings and controls for Apple devices. If they only support automated device enrollment, then they require that supervised function. Therefore, you can only apply them to your own devices. If not, if it supports all enrollment types, then it's applicable to bring your own device as well. So you just need to make consideration there when you're designing, creating these configuration settings. Now, as we issue configuration out to the machines, each configuration profile gives us a status of the number of machines and the number of users that we've have adopted it, whether or not it's succeeded in pushing that setting to the device or not. And we can see that status here through the device status and the user status. The important bit to know about the assignment is, although you might assign a configuration to either all devices or all users or a combination, my advice would be, wherever possible, assign it to the users. Using device assignments, kind of reserve that to be specific scenarios. Do a bit of research around that before you get into that area. When you assign a device appropriate control to a user, it's just saying that issue the setting to the machine because this user is logged on, and then it will be applied to the device because it's a device specific setting. So configuration profiles in a nutshell, how you get settings and controls out to the devices after they've enrolled. Very briefly, just to highlight that you can issue PowerShell scripts if you've got certain things that you want to configure on a Windows system, you can also now issue a macOS script that will execute in the terminal on that particular device, and you can opt to run that as the signed in user or as the system service account that the Endpoint Manager client is running as on the device. So a great deal of control has been added there to macOS and to Windows through those PowerShell and terminal scripts. We also use Endpoint Manager to control all the updates to Windows specifically. So for Windows, all we're doing here is producing the same controls that we would have done through group policy by creating those update rings or those tiers. So which users get the updates first. So they're the kind of guinea pigs that are going to then feed back to the IT team to let us know, do we have any problems with this, with any of our apps? And then that gives us some breathing space to address those problems before the subsequent updates roll out to the rest of the business. This is just like a configuration profile in that it's sort of on, off, choose your options. And those of you that have configured this in group policy will note that these are all the same settings that we're issuing here. Again, it's just a point of being able to issue these directly over the web. No need to call home, no need to access group policy in order to get them. And you layer them out for as many of those rings or kind of staged updates as you want. There is an ability here to hold the machines on a certain feature update. So where we get those builds of Windows every 6 months, if we create a profile in here to target some users and tell them that we want all those machines on 2004, they'll only go as far as version 2004, and then they'll hold there until you come in here and change that setting. So if you've got a requirement to do that, that's a useful way to go about it. The last piece of updates is only applicable to iOS. There's no update controls at the moment, unfortunately, for Android or for the Mac OS. But for iOS, we can create a profile in here and we can tell it which version we want the system to come up to and hold at that particular version, when we want them to do the updates themselves. So if we want to ensure that our company owned and managed iOS devices aren't installing the operating system upgrades during the day, we can specify a kind of out of hours window, so they'll do it kind of after work. So that's update controls in a nutshell, and the configuration of getting settings and things out onto the PCs. So I said at the beginning, Endpoint's purpose really is to get settings and apps out onto the machines and then check them. So applications is the next big kind of area that I want to just give you an overview on. Again, we can target the 4 operating system types with our applications. And for each vendor, there's a slightly different way that we go about them. I'll cover the mobile ones first because they're relatively straightforward. For iOS and the iPad OS, we want to try and bring those apps in through Apple Business Manager. There's 2 ways that apps come into Endpoint Manager for iOS, and that is either through Apple Business Manager in this volume purchase program option, or as just assignments from the iOS store. I would advise, wherever possible, use the volume purchase program app model to push apps to the users, because by doing it that way, you'll be able to select an additional option in here when it comes to assignment of the device. And when we assign it to the users, we can assign the license as a device type of license. By doing that, the user does not require or need to know their iCloud or iTunes credentials in order to receive the app onto the device. So whether it's a bring your own device model or a wholly owned and managed supervised device that the company's brought in through Business Manager, using that device license type during the assignment process, because we got the apps through Apple Business Manager and added them into Intune, that allows you to force the app onto the device with no interaction by the user. The store added apps are slightly different. We can only specify whether or not they are required or available for the user to click to do the download from them. There's no control there as to how the user gets it, because by nature of the fact that it's just an assignment that says you need to go and get this, they then have to put their credentials in and be signed into the iCloud service in order to download the app. So assignment of apps through Apple Business Manager preferably. Apple Business Manager synchronizes them into here. Select the apps that you want to push out to the users, and through their properties on here, it's just simply a case of editing the assignment if you want to send that out to all users. And this is where I would suggest that you change that license assignment type to device each time. That way, you know that that application is going to make it out onto to all the devices. For Android, very similar. The Android model is all governed by the Google Play Store. So whether it's pushing the apps into the work profile or it's placing them directly onto the device, go through your Google Play account, just like you would your Apple Business Manager account, select all the apps that you want, and then Endpoint Manager will synchronize those apps here into the service. And then it's just a case of editing the assignment and either requiring or making that application available to the users. You'll note on here there are no other options outside of just assigned or not assigned or available. That's because Google managed that whole ecosystem of apps in a very specific way. So the device has to be attached in some way to the Google Play platform so that the analytics and everything from Google's world will continue to function. So that's the kind of mobile devices, pretty straightforward. Get it from their store. In Endpoint Manager is just doing an assignment to make sure that the app is out on the device. For installation of apps for Windows, we have three options in here. We can get apps from the Microsoft Store for Business. So again, look at how you sign up for the Business Store service. It's built into all the Office 365 signups, so it already exists if you have Office 365. And then select the apps that you want from the Business Store. There are more and more of them becoming popular that we want to push, like the OneNote for Windows 10 now works much more conveniently as a Business Store app than it does as a deployment of part of the Office suite. So those are things that you'll want to bring into here. For all the other types of Windows app that we have, they fall into either created for you categories. So that covers Office 365 apps to go onto the PC. It's just to select the app and push it out to the users that you want. And the Edge browser. So that's the Chromium version of the Edge browser. So those are the created for you, no settings required, just assign them to the users and the deployment completes. Then we have your own applications that you need to package to get out onto the devices. The types of applications that we support for that model of delivery are either the MSI files that we used to do with group policy, or we can package any application that starts with a setup executable using a application packager for Intune. It produces this component file called Intune Win. We upload that and then assign that to the devices. A couple of tips here around this: follow the guides. They're pretty straightforward. The process required to actually complete this doesn't take all of that long. It's effectively one command line that will package up the contents of the setup exe in one folder location on your machine. However, at least for the time being, you want to try and ensure that you're either doing all MSIs or all Win32 packages targeted at either the device or the user, mixing those two together. So a mixture of MSIs and Win32s targeted at devices specifically can cause problems during the autopilot startup process, just because the Windows has a habit of trying to run both MSIs and Win32 installs simultaneously, and the Windows installer can trip over that, especially if the setup executable you've got is actually a wrapper around an MSI. Adobe are very good at that. Buried in those executables are MSIs. So it's going to try and call the same installation process when Windows starts. So bit of testing, have a look at how you do that, but you've got both models. So there's absolutely no reason why you can't deploy anything that starts as a setup executable or an MSI file through this process. Content storage for those deployment packages is all held within Endpoint Manager. So I'd have to check the actual number. I think it's 25 gigs each. So the account has plenty of storage available to hold those application packages to push those out to your end users. Mac OS follows a very similar process. We've got the pre-curated apps. There's no link at the moment into the Mac App Store from Endpoint Manager, but we can push the same line of business apps. So in exactly the same way we use the Intune wrapper to package the Intune Win files, we can take Apple installation packages, use a Mac, and we can package them in exactly the same way. It just so happens it gives us a file called an Intune Mac, a .intune Mac file, and we can upload that here as a line of business application and push that to the users. There is another method for management or co-management of the Mac OS. If you're heavily invested in the kind of online management services for Mac OS, you can co-administer within Endpoint Manager. You're effectively handing the app deployment part of Endpoint Manager to the third-party service, and then just using the feedback from that to check for compliance. And compliance is something we'll come on to in just a few moments. So nearly at the end of the application piece, application services allow us to apply these app protection policies. App protection policies are all about being able to contain the data within the app. So on iOS or Android, you should create these for all the supported applications that you deploy. That will allow you to restrict things like copy and paste and save as, and it should form part of your DLP strategy for the organization, so to make sure you haven't got a whole load of data leaks coming out of those mobile devices. For Windows, this gives you an added layer of protection around that kind of bring your own device model. So it's really most effective where you've got users who enroll a PC with Endpoint Manager for management, because you give them that BYOD option. But because it's still technically their device and they're administrators of it, you want to place an extra layer of wrap around the apps and the services they're using. Check out what's possible at the moment. It uses the Windows Information Protection Platform. There are a handful of services that are, have been configured for us around the likes of Edge and the Office suite of applications that work with that Windows Information Protection service. And finally, in the apps area, I just want to touch on app configuration policies. These are great for getting settings out, especially to mobile devices where you want to ensure that all of the browser shortcuts are put into the Edge application, that the home page is set correctly, and more importantly, for where you're building that DLP scenario and you want to ensure that users of Outlook, for example, when they click a link that takes them to a browser page, are sent into a browser that you have control over and management of. So you can use that to set things like force the use of Edge as the default browser, and then you can pull Edge in behind one of the app protection policies so they can't copy content out of Edge and save it into other applications. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of applications and how we use the deployment of apps and the control of apps through Endpoint Manager's services. Compliance policies is the area where we check that the device has actually adhered to this. And this is where we'll lead on next time, I think, into the conditional access piece, and how we use that in Azure Active Directory. The whole purpose of a compliance policy is, as I say, to check that the device has adopted the controls and the settings that you want. And there are certain areas there that, especially with Windows, that allow you to check the user completed what you requested through the configuration policy. So, for example, BitLocker's configuration policy might say encrypt the local drive, but it might also say and make the user set a PIN number. So if you've chosen that option to have a boot PIN with BitLocker to encrypt or to decrypt the drive on startup, that's a user interaction that they need to do. So it will be a toast notification from Windows that says, click here, you need to complete this. They need to put the PIN number in order to set it. So the compliance policy will let you check that the encryption process has completed. So you want to make sure you've created at least one compliance policy for each operating system type that you're going to support, and tie that back to in the device controls for enrollment, what are they allowed to enroll? So make sure the platforms that you've got policies for in here match the platforms that they are allowed to enroll, so you know you've got some checks and governance against them. One piece that I will just show on here, which is relatively new to Endpoint Manager, is the ability to look at the Defender for Endpoint, or the ATP service, and see what sort of risk score it's placed on the device. So you can start to leverage more compliance information around the system. So not only has it met all the checks for is encrypted, has a firewall on, the things that you've set through your configuration profiles, but you can now dive into Endpoint Manager and look at the risk scores, which will focus on things like, are there any outstanding CVE or known vulnerabilities from the CVE database? Is the version of Adobe out of date? That will start to push things up the risk score. So you can leverage that information here in compliance. And as I said, compliance is all about being able to check the device as well as the user's credentials before they go to access any of your data and your services. So the very final piece, because I know we set this session as 45 minutes, the final piece that I want to cover here is around the endpoint security tie-in. So what this essentially is are the controls for Defender. That might be Defender for Endpoint if you've licensed the ATP function for PCs, firewalls on the PCs, the ASR systems, and the detection and response services, so the attack surface reduction, things like the smart screen filters that are built into Windows. It's one place to bring all the controls together and give you a simple way to populate the settings that you want. So most of these functions can be found in devices and through configuration profiles, but to find it in one place that's easy to view and easy to manage, you can come into here into the endpoint security container and then create and edit the policies specific to things like your antivirus controls. So these will all look sort of fairly familiar to everybody. It's things like, do we want real-time protection to be on? What are we monitoring for? Do we want it to quarantine things? How long do we keep things in quarantine for? How often do we want to perform a daily scan? Or what happens when the machine's been off for a while and needs to perform an update scan? For Defender specifically, it has that background download of definitions for when it's not online. So how frequently do you want it to do those? Same things repeated through here for disk encryption and firewall controls, and all the various other functions of ATP. So it's one place to come to see, have those been adopted? So unhealthy endpoints would indicate they haven't adopted those, and whether or not the service has reported back any malware or any violations of the policy. So really handy new dashboard that was added sort of beginning of this year. What they also added at the same time was this idea of security baselines. The only word of warning I would give you with security baselines is they are updated from time to time. So it will show you if you have baseline versions that are out of date that you've provisioned, so you need to check those if you're going to use them. And also the baseline itself is actually an amalgamation of all the settings in here, so it's creating these policies for you through one kind of scripted process. So if you have already added configuration profiles into the device section into here that target things like the Defender service or the BitLocker service, you may be duplicating those again by using the baselines or by manually adding them again in here. If you do that, you will get notice of a conflict, so it's worth looking out for those. Finally, if you have enabled Defender for Endpoint or licensed the Defender for Endpoint service, you join it into Endpoint Manager in here, and that is your method of automating the deployment process for the Windows Security Center out onto your estate of PCs. And all of this done without any need for any scripting or any group policy locally on the domain, or any connection to the local domain if you wish to use the Azure Active Directory join model instead of the traditional Active Directory. And from here, you've got a handy link that will take you into the Security Center, and that's where you then start to define controls and look at what vulnerabilities and things exist out across your estate of PCs. That's a whole nother topic. We'll probably come into that one after we've looked in a bit more depth at Configuration Manager. Now I'm going to stop at that point there. I think I've had my 45-minute run as we'd advertised. So we'll start to have a look now into the Q&A and see if I can answer any of your questions for you. Okay, so can we onboard or enroll Windows 10 devices without autopilot? Our computers are Azure AD joined, hybrid joined, and supplied to users pre-configured by system image. Yeah, absolutely. So the autopilot piece is only there to manage devices that have not been added to Azure AD via some other method. So by having hybrid Azure AD joined devices, you would just need to enable the MDM functions of Endpoint Manager, and from your scenario, that would be a group policy setting that would trigger all the machines to go and call out to Endpoint Manager and enroll themselves. So yeah, absolutely, don't need autopilot at all. If you're coming with a hybrid model, it's just a group policy setting that you'd issue to the PCs. We've got a question for Windows desktop enrollment. What would be the best way to enroll a device that is already in use with installed applications and configurations? So machine where fresh autopilot install is not desired. You would either follow the bring your own device model. So if you need it to be manual, the users would go through settings and join workplace and then enroll to Intune through that process. If they're all in a work group, you know, kind of standalone machines, and you want to bring them in, but they're already configured, you can go through that manual process. It will initially leave the users as local administrators, because presumably they are at the moment in order to get through that process, or the user that does it needs to be an administrator to complete that function. There is a way through those configuration profiles, those custom URIs, that we can revoke the administrative access and hand over the global admins and the device admins control that you would normally get through the fresh start and the autopilot process. So I would follow the BYOD model unless your devices are all domain joined, in which case follow the hybrid model and use that group policy setting to bring them over into Endpoint Manager. We've got when setting configuration profiles or PowerShell scripts, is there a way to force these to be applied immediately rather than when the device checks in? No, actually, that's a good point to bring up. Endpoint Manager has a timed cycle on which processes are run. So issuing things like scripts or new applications or change of configuration on the initial join of a PC, it will keep rerunning that process to check for new settings and check to make sure everything's been applied in a frequency of a number of minutes. It works its way down from, there's like a 5-minute timer to start with, then it moves to a 15-minute timer, and then those processes occur throughout the first 8 hours. When you get to the machine having been enrolled for 8 hours, it then switches to an 8-hour timed event. So Intune's check-in process is designed so that on boot, it will check in to look for adjustments or changes and then store them. And then the agent itself on the PC has an 8-hour refresh timer, and that's all designed around load balancing, the kind of global cloud of Endpoint Manager. So no, there often isn't a way to enforce the script immediately upon sync. The best way you can get a timed event to know that things are going to happen is to use PowerShell scripts to issue scheduled tasks to the PC and set the time on that when you want it to run. So you could set a scheduled task to run, I don't know, every 5 minutes for an hour. As soon as it's on, then you know that it has at least completed through that point, and then have the task kind of automatically expire. So that would be the way to try and deal with those. When deploying apps and programs through Windows 10, how is this triggered? Do they have to sign into company portal or as soon as they first sign in? So again, the trigger process happens on that 8-hour timer. Once the machine is joined to the Endpoint Manager service, whether it's only an Endpoint Manager through Bring Your Own Device, or whether it's through a hybrid or an Azure AD join and possibly autopilot, but whether it's your device or the user's device, that timer is always running in the background every 8 hours. If you've assigned the installation as required to either the user or the device, then on that next synchronize event, it will then start to do the download and perform the installation. If you've made the application available in the assignment, then yes, the users need to go to company portal in order to get that installation. Yes, a recording of the session will be available, and I'll talk to the marketing team. If you want a downloadable copy, I'm sure that can be arranged for you as well. Can we import packages from SCCM to Endpoint Manager? Largely the packages in SCCM are already in the format that we need in order to convert them, but there isn't a direct process at the moment to just hand over the contents of your task sequence and your packages to Endpoint Manager. If you've gone to the extent of creating those packages for Endpoint Manager, then you'll have already tested how the installations work for the executables, or there'll be MSI files. So the process of loading those into Endpoint Manager will be exactly the same as when you added them to the Config Manager. So it shouldn't be a massive task to do that. How compatible is Endpoint Security with third-party AV and disk encrypting? Not expecting to manage it, but at least be handled third-party. Okay, so a couple of pieces there. For the encryption piece, there's a check for disks are encrypted that's available for compliance. So if you're using a third-party encryption tool, use that check. That doesn't need to know that it's BitLocker. It's just a check for is encrypted. So you can leverage the compliance piece around there. For antivirus itself, it's obviously not going to report back, but we frequently deploy other antivirus agents out onto PCs using Config Manager to push the app out onto it. Again, how we want to address the compliance piece around that. Some antivirus providers have got some integration that allows us to leverage things like the risk scores. But again, that's sort of vendor to vendor. So antivirus, yes, we can do the deployment of the agents, but largely always managed within that vendor's product. For encryption techniques, you can use Endpoint Manager to assess the state of any encryption model. Can you use MDM to update applications? Yes, we didn't cover that, but to update applications that have not come through Windows Update, when you deploy the package, you can keep replacing that package. So repackage the setup executable when a new version comes out, or take the newest iteration of the MSI file and just keep loading it over the top of the application. Intune will recognize that the version changed and will reissue the installation command to the PCs and perform the upgrade. Where you've also got scenarios that you've done an installation using MSIs or a setup executable, and that package is then going to self-update on the device, you can flag in Endpoint Manager that it should not check the version. That way it will only ever try once. If you then keep changing the package version, new installs will get it because they don't have a version of it, but old installs won't try and do the upgrade through Endpoint Manager. They're going to assume that the product is doing it itself. Can we disable or block Win 10 hardware systems with Endpoint, for example, disabling USB ports or turning off the camera? At the moment, yes, but it's pretty much all done through those URI controls. So it's like taking the group policy controls that we used to do by pushing registry settings and things out to the PCs to block those functions. There are some controls in there, and if you're going down the route of Endpoint Defender for Endpoint, or the old Defender ATP system, that's now gained a whole load of controls around DLP of USB functions and what can and can't be copied on and off onto removable media. So it might be worth looking at that as a service. How can you manage apps on users' home computers, e.g. MAM for home computers? Okay, probably a separate topic, which I will take as feedback to bring up. PCs and MAM controls on PCs are pretty limited. So the way we would go about that is to do it through something called the Cloud App Security Broker, separate service to Endpoint Manager. But the notion there is that you're reverse proxying their connection to the service that they signed in with, and because they signed into it using your Azure AD connected account, we can then proxy everything they try and do with that app and then prevent content from getting onto the machine that shouldn't be. But yeah, if whoever's question that was, and that came in anonymously, if you want to reach out, my email address there, I'll quite happily take you through the whole pitfalls and the do's and don'ts with the Windows information protection piece around isolation like MAM on a home PC. Final question, I have a mix of devices. Can I use MDM to update hardware drivers? My recommendation there would be to use the vendor's packages. So if it's like Dell Command Update or the HP tools, Lenovo have their own set. Use Endpoint Manager to issue those to the devices and then issue the controls for those update packages through scripts or sometimes you can package them with the application. Trying to actually push driver packs and things out isn't recommended, not a great plan for Endpoint Manager. Okay, that kind of brings us to the end of the questions. We've overrun a little bit there, so thank you all very much for your time today. As I say, there'll be a shared link to watch again on this that you can hand around, and we'll have a look, and I'll speak to the marketing team, see if we can arrange a downloadable copy. Thank you very much for joining us today. Actually, one last point, just to say, use my contact details on screen there. If you do want to go through any particular scenario in detail, as I said at the beginning, we can arrange for sessions to look specifically at your scenario, and we have an hour's slot available for anybody as a new customer. If you want to do that, please get in touch.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thanks. I really enjoyed that and was scribbling some notes as we went along. And yeah, thank you everyone for all your questions again. So we will be running some more tech talks in the future. So please have a look, keep a lookout for our communications on our social media, on our website, via email as well. And you'll get notified that way of future topics that we'll cover. And thank you very much again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at another Tech Talk again in the near future. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.